Hey, everybody. Hope you folks had a good lunch. So just wanted to ask, how many of you use AWS? A lot of you. How many would like AWS's tools to break down after a change? Nobody. Okay, so for our next talk, we're going to be talking about living and breathing backwards compatible changes. Please welcome Leandro and Henrique.
Hello. Hey, as I was introduced, my name is Leandro. I have here my colleague Henrique. We work with maintaining Powertools, open source tool that help customers to adopt best practices in Lambda. So today we are going to talk about living and breathing backwards compatible changes. So, and let's start this with this meme. So every time you need to make changes, every time you need to evolve our systems, every time you need to fix bugs, every time you need to create some new code, and it can lead us to creating breaking changes. So sometimes it's inevitable. You can avoid that, but you need to evolve your system. So today we are going to cover how you can do that on Powertools and how you cover that and you try to avoid making breaking changes. So let me start with this big guy, the PAP 3000. Most of you, I'm sure that know this proposition. And in 2006, Python needed to update the version. Python needed to add more features. Python needed to add more performance, fix some bugs, and it was needed to update the major version. So Python needed to update from Python 2 to Python 3. And there are a very interesting thing in this PHP. So you have a statement here that say, not even a subset of your code will work from Python 2 to Python 3 without changes. Of course, some piece of code works, but this is a good statement to understand what is a breaking change. And how was the cost to developers, to the business? Some of developers took like years to migrate systems from Python 2 to Python 3. Some companies abandoned Python because it was hard to update and you need to have more performance. I don't know why you heard some things about that. But not even all changes must be huge like that. Not all breaking changes must be huge like that. And this is why we'll try to cover this today and demonstrate to you that you can make breaking changes with profit and let you the customer know about it. So let me ask a question if someone give a word about that. What does breaking change mean for you? If someone wants to give a word of that. No, I see people think about break changes in two ways. The first way is breaking change is you can't break the contract of your API. So given API, you have a method that exposes two parameters, A and B, and you have customers consuming this API, consuming this method, and you can't remove for example, the parameter B. If you remove that, you are breaking the contract. So for someone that depends on your API, won't longer works because you remove the parameter. But I see people talking about breaking changes if you change the behavior. So given the same API, you release a new version, you didn't remove any parameters, but you introduce a new behavior. Instead of these APIs returning all records from database, it's just an example, it just returning paginated records. And you need to invoke many times the same API to get the same result that you had in the last version. So not all breaking changes is just about the breaking the contract. And if you think about breaking changes and say, hey, I see these two options, and I think that it depends what is breaking change. In my opinion, you might be wrong. So let me introduce this guy. Who is this guy? This is Hiram Wright. So sorry, Hiram. I have problem to pronounce your name because it's the problem of Brazilians speaking English sometimes. But this guy is a Google engineer that he's famous for a very specific statement. the Harum's law. I don't like to read it slides, but let me read it this one. With a sufficient number of users of an API, it does not matter what you promise in the contract. All observable behaviors of your systems will be depended on by somebody. Let me focus on that. All observable behaviors of your systems will be dependent on somebody. So what that means? Let me get this case from XKCD, a famous web2 website, and you have a new version that was launched, and the CPU no longer overheats your computer, and it's good because it fixes a critical bug. But we have the user force say, hey, you broke my workflow. When you updated this behavior, when you changed the behavior that pressing spacebar don't hit my CPU, you broke my workflow. So we have here a clear example what is a breaking change. What a part of breaking change. Okay, breaking contract is a breaking change. But if you change the behavior, you never know the all workflow that your customer has. You never all behavior that your customers expect about that. And in Python specifically, we have some challenges. Python is my preferred language. I love that, but you need to talk about challenges in Python. Dynamic type in Python could lead us to introduce break changes because you can change it in the runtime. For example, the code is running, a variable from string to int. So if you don't use MyPy, for example, to check static type in our development environment, you can create a break change with no intention, but you can create. Global namespace, I can't see it many times, but if you create a namespace, it can conflict with another API from the customers. And the thing that, in my opinion, is one of the most problematic things in Python when you try to avoid breaking changes, no visibility modifiers. Basically, when you define an API, understand an API like a class with a lot of methods, we can define, for example, private variables. We can define private methods by using underscore or others. But even we do that, the customer has access to all properties in Python. The customers can rely, for example, in a private property that you define it, and if you change that in the next release, so you can break a behavior of the customer, you can break a code of the customer, because we never know all the situations that customer, all the behaviors, all the workflow that customers are using our code. And what's the impact of a breaking change in an open source project? In an open source project that we work on. So we have many of impacts, but I would like to focus on 3 of them. Compatibility issues. If all the releases that you do in your open source code, you introduce your problems to have compatibility with the previous version, you have a problem of breaking changes, and you can lose the confidence of your customers. Adoption challenges. Imagine that you have an open source project, you wanted that to have more styles on GitHub, you have that the community, you wanted that the community adopt your project, but the community have a vision, have a understand your project that every release you expect a breaking change, or every release you never know what is expected. You need to review your code, you may break your pipeline. So this is a problematic to make breaking change every time. And the most dangerous for me when working with open source, because open source you basically depends on the community, we depend on the adoptions, and to make the project successfully, we need the community engagement on that. So if you make breaking changes and if you don't communicate to your customer, if you don't have a process to do that, the customer can go to the Twitter, even GitHub, and say, hey, please don't adopt this project, don't do that, because every new release, this project introduces a breaking change. I tried a lot about problems, but from now, we will try to explain for you how we did that, moving from updating from version 1 to version 2 in Powertools.
Thank you, Leandro. Good morning, everyone. So as we mentioned at the beginning, my name is Henrique, Graça, and my colleague Leandro Damascena, and we're both specialist SAs at AWS. Although we live and breathe Powertools for AWS, we are almost full-time developers. We are SAs as well, because we talk to customers, get their feedback, and essentially that's what we do. How many of you are familiar with the AWS hands? How many of you are familiar with Power Tools and Lambda? Do you use it? Nice. Oh, wow. Cool, cool, cool. Yeah, we're in a Python conference. So yeah, the Power Tools, for those who are not familiar, is an open source project. So we build, although we are AWS employees, we build everything in the open. And we obviously do that for this tool. So to talk about the beginning, the journey, right? So there's always a beginning. This all started in early 2020 when we released, or AWS released, the well-architected serverless lens tool. Essentially, this is a tool that gives you insights and best practices to assess your serverless workloads. And if you are using serverless, you're probably already familiar with this, this tool, this assessment. So while this was ongoing, in the first 6 months, we had probably more than 10,000 customers applying and answering this assessment. And one of the main questions that we asked is which services should be optimized to improve your customer experience using serverless? And those were the three main answers we got. So, and the challenges customer had while using serverless, while implementing distributed tracing, structured logging, and metrics, right? So these were the three things that we found customers struggling more. And if you build serverless in the past 2, 3, 4 years, you felt this pain as well. So if we dive a little bit into the metrics example, by default, we all get from our cloud providers, in this case, AWS, system metrics, right? HTTP errors, success rates, failure rates, etc. But how about business metrics, customer experience, operational metrics? How do we know what it was placed on the customer's cart? How is the latency? How long do they take to add items to a cart? Pipeline, operational metrics. How do we know the release frequency? So all of those things we can get with metrics. And this is something that we as developers and engineers, and since we are in a Python conference, and I was sitting in the crowd and I saw some laptops open, terminals, VS Code. I saw someone trying to exit Vim as well. So we are in a developer conference. And as an engineer, something we would do is just get into Lambda and start writing some code, right? And this is an example for a simple metric. We call the AWS 3 SDK, right? And then we just call the API put metric. This is very easy, I think. But for one single metric, for me, as engineers, we are lazy, and that's a good thing. This, for me, looks like a lot of code. And as well as in the note there, for every 1,000 requests, we pay $1 to send these metrics to CloudWatch. The other thing is, as you see there, this is not asynchronous, so you're gonna introduce some blocking, right? Some latency to your Lambdas, which is not great. A lot of people do it, but we think there is a better way of doing it. And this is why we then worked on and released Lambda Powertools for AWS, which you can see as a easy example of metrics. We instantiate metrics. We can even decorate our Lambda handler to get Lambda context information like cold starts. And then we push to the API metrics.add metrics. Simple API, clean and easy to use. The other good thing is all of these metrics use EMF, embedded metrics format to push those metrics. Essentially, we put those metrics in the logs asynchronously. CloudWatch or AWS will push those metrics to CloudWatch, and you have those metrics there in a more cost-efficient and non-blocking way. And yeah, Power Tools for AWS Lambda is a collection of utilities that adopt these best practices. As I mentioned, is open source, and at its core, we provide these three utilities: logger, metrics, and tracer. But there's more we can have and see under the hood, like we're going to mention now. So for Ops1 solution, to answer to that question, how will we deal with metrics, tracing, and logging? This is it. With 3 lines of code, we just decorate our Lambda handler. We can in code push metrics and tracers as we want. But the bare minimum, we just add those 3 annotations to our handlers, and we take care of that situation. And this is a much easier way to assess the health of your serverless application and conform to the serverless lens tool we saw. But obviously, Logger, metrics, and tracer are not the only things we do. Most of our work, as I explained at the beginning, is to talk to customers, get their feedback, have interviews, help them adopt Power Tools, and much more. So we did this almost 4 years of having serverless lens, creating Power Tools. We have come up with a lot of pain points and trying to ease the pain of customers. For instance, idempotency. Let's imagine that you have a Lambda running on an SQS or something, and you don't want to repeat events. You can have idempotency, batch processing, streaming, secrets, parameters, feature flags. So we have all of that. And we are, since it's an open source project, we have issues. We can get feedback from customers, either customers we talk to, or if you want, it's an open source project, create an issue, and we can discuss with you how to implement it or contribute. That's the best part, contributions. And obviously, Lambda, Power Tools for Lambda was initially created for Python. It's the best utility in terms of the runtimes. It has more support, more features, but we also have other languages. If by any reason you use Java in serverless, I'm sorry, but yeah, you can use it Power Tools as well. TypeScript and .NET are also good options you can use. And lastly, in terms of community. So as you've seen, since 2020 has been steady growth, right, of stargazers on GitHub. And we always welcome contributions. For the people that raised their hands in the beginning, thank you. And if you have any feedback, features, let us know outside. Me and Leandro will be here. For those that don't use it, if you want to chat with us, come have a chat of how to adopt this in your companies. And this was always at the beginning of the journey. And the reason why we live and breathe those breaking changes is because we felt a pain on building this real world software for our customers in the open, which is even more challenging. So in version 1 released in June 2020, version 2 after 2 years of release. And this is something that Leandro is going to talk about our journey to get to that stage. And after we released V2, it took almost 7 months for people to migrate from V1 to V2. And that was, again, another one of those challenges. So with that, Leandro is going to talk about the lessons we learned throughout our journey. And thank you for listening.
Hi. We spoke a lot about problems. Now you understand Power Tools, what you did, but we spoke a lot of problems. Don't do this, don't do that, and do the same. But what you learned about when you make the journey to updating, to maintain a open source project, we don't know, we don't have all the answers. We are failing, we fail sometimes, but you learn from these failures. So I will try to show here what you did and what you're doing to maintain an open source project and avoid losing confidence from the customer. And let me split this one in 3 phases: before, during, and after. Before, you may think that avoid breaking changes. Hey, I use semantic version, because semantic version is I have a patch release, I have a minor release, and I have a major release. And usually libraries use the major release to release a new versions, and in breaking something, and breaking API contracts, and in breaking other things. But now we have 3 problems. And I'm not to say that semantic version is not good. We use that. But we have 3 problems. The patch problems, the minor problem, and the major problem. And why this is a problem? Because semantic version defines some best practice to update your library and define the versions of your library, but it's not very clear about the compatibility changes. This is not very clear what you need to do to avoid breaking changes. So it's not covered behavior, for example, when you release a patch release. So semantic version is one way to do that, but it's not all the answer for that. And here I start saying what you did. So the first thing that we did, to gain the confidence of the customer and to make clear our communication to the customers is creating a public roadmap. So the customer can now know exactly what expected about our releases. We have this roadmap saying, hey, in the next release, the next minor release, or the next major release, we expected to launch this feature. So what's the benefit of that? Because by seeing that, the customer can go to the repositories and say, hey, I don't agree with this new release, or I don't agree with the feature that you plan to launch in the next major release, or you may include this release, or you may not. So you are working on a public repository, you are doing open source, so a good practice, and you have a lot of feedbacks about that, create a roadmap. So the customers know exactly what expected about the next versions. Let me pass here. Work in public. And this one is the thing that particularly we do the best. So everything that you have is public, except the confidential data, because you can share, of course. No one can share confidential data for company, but everything that you do is public. We keep this board, this is a project in GitHub, updated. So the customer can go there, the customer can look at the issues, the discussions. We have some discussion that we need to interact with the Lambda team, the Lambda runtime team that manages Lambda, the service Lambda. We put that on the issues, and the customers can go there and understand exactly what's going on. So, and GitHub has a lot of automation that you can create a project to automate that, and you have a good governance and clear communication to the project. Let me say a thing that we did before creating a breaking change. This was a breaking change that we created, but we should go there. We would go there and say, hey, we are breaking changing the version 2, and you are removing the support to batch processing using decorator, the legacy code, but we didn't do that. Instead of that, we deprecated this utility. We removed that from our first section of the documentation and put that on the bottom. So the customer, it's harder to find how this works in the legacy code. And you promoted the new code to the first sections of the documentation. I have another very useful case about the deprecating path is PyDentity. I know some of you are using PyDentity. PyDentity has released the version 2 months ago, I don't remember. And PyDentity made a very good thing. So PyDentity, instead of removing support for the PyDentity v1, they deprecated most of the methods. So the customer can seamlessly move from PyDentity v1 to PyDentity v2. It's the same that we do in PowerTools. So, okay, it was before you make a breaking change. And when you need to do a breaking change, when you need to have a decision and say, hey, we need to make a breaking change. How do you do that? So, oops. One thing that you try to do is not break it in the first place. I mean, this piece of code, snippet of code, you have a utility called the event handler that manages request on API gateway. And initially you have the first field allow origin. So it's our force control, and the customer could inform just one origin. But customers went to repository and said, hey, I want to allow more than one origin. I want to add more origin because I have a lot of domains. I have a service site as a service. And what if we could do in this case? Okay, I will transform the first field, allow origin, in allow origins in the plural. And instead of it sees a string, I could change the type to be a list because it's a type more than once. It's a breaking change. Someone that using that and you rely on the type that is string, now it's have a breaking change because it's not more a string, it's a list. Instead of that, we created a new field called extra origins that now we allow the customer that want to use more than one origin to inform that one in the next field. It's hard because you need now to maintain two codes, but you are planning to remove that in the next release, the next major release of PowerTools. So try to avoid to break it in the first place. So make it obvious. Every time that you need to make a breaking change, go to the repository, open a RFC, open an issue, and make it explicit. Say to the customer, hey, this RFC will introduce a breaking change, and you are planning to do that in the next release or the next one. You updated, in this case, we updated our roadmap based on RFC that is a breaking change. Test your documentation snippets. Another thing that we are very good is providing documentation examples to our customers. When you create the documentation and when you integrate this documentation in our core, we can test the documentation. We can run linter, we can run MyPy against our documentation, for example, and MyPy can detect some changes that we made in our code and avoid breaking changes. End-to-end tests. I know that most of you do that, they are familiar, but I see that many open source projects or many other projects don't run end-to-end tests in every commit. We do that. Every commit that you have in our repository, we run an end-to-end test because it's good to avoid regressions when you are creating new features or when you fix bugs, and it makes clear that you are not breaking anything for the customer. Okay, now we know that we do before what you do during, but after a breaking change, what is needed to do? Now we have a breaking change. Now we have customers that want to update from version 1 to version 2, and Henrique explained it. It took like 7 months, 1 year. How to help customers to adopt this new version with breaking changes? So the first one, invest in the documentation. So if you go now to the Powertools repository, doesn't matter the language, you see a lot of examples of documentation, diagrams saying, hey, to use this documentation, to use this feature, you can copy this snippet of code, and this feature will work like that. That customer invoke a Lambda and blah, 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 and follow this workflow. So documentation for open source projects is very important to trust, to gain confidence of your customer. The other thing that we spend a lot of time, I can say that I spend sometimes almost a day, is to make a release note. It's the only part of our pipeline that is manual. We do that manual because we have a human right here, and you try to show to the customer what features, what bugs, or doesn't matter why, introducing this release. So we spend, I can say by my experience, and the same with Henrique, I spend sometimes a day to write a release note because it's very important to have a clear communication with our customer. So try to add some snippets on your release notes to make easy customers adopt this new feature. This is an example that we introduced Datadog as a provider. Upgrade guide. Let me spend it like 30 seconds. I know that we are running out of time. I did this for 2 minutes. Okay. Let me spend just 1 minute on the upgrade guide. Now, okay, now we have a new release. We made break changes. The customer wants to update to the major version in adopting that because it's very important. But how can I help customer to adopt this new version? Create an upgrade guide. Tell to the customer, hey, to upgrade this utility to this new version, you did this and that. So we broke code. You need to more IAM permission. You need to change your code. Create a clear upgrade guide. It's very important when you are working with open source and you want that the community adopt your product. So this is a quick summary of our upgrade guide from version 1 to version 2. And you can see what you broke. So the changes that you made, if you need to change your code, and if you need to change IAM permission. Because if you need to change either your code or your IAM permission, this is a breaking change because it's not working in the new version without change. So this is another example of legacy batch process. I will skip this slide because we are running out of time. And reduce MTTF. What that means? We have best intentions. We strive to avoid breaking changes all the time, but we fail. Sometimes we will do that. Sometimes my pipe can't get the problem, our pipeline can get, the end-to-end test can get the problem, but we create a problem and you create a regression or a breaking change for a customer without intention. So what do you do to avoid that? We have a fast response when you do this. So this is an example that a customer releases a new version and a customer that are a heavy user of Powertools say, hey, you create a patch release and you introduce a breaking change. So what you did in this case, with only 30 minutes by the customer open the issue, we release a new patch release, we release a new version fixing that breaking change. So reducing the time of that you respond, that you give a response to your customer and they again gain confidence of the customer, it's very important. This is an example of our pipeline that take like 10 minutes to release a version, to build a version, create layers and Lambda layers, and publish the PyPy release. So I would like to say thank you for you all. Again, my name is Leandro Damascena with my colleague Henrique, and we are here to talk about a little bit more about the community where you can find Powertools and how to do it.